Good morning, everybody. My name is Stephen Murphy. I'm the chair of the Center for Applied Sciences in Ontario Protected Areas, otherwise known as Casiopa. I'm joined this morning by Stephanie Cruz-Masonette. She is a PhD student who is being supervised by me, and she is going to be the co-host this morning in case sort of things go disastrously wrong. We're actually very pleased to have a whole large audience this morning, and of course, this is being recorded for posterity and will be available on the YouTube channel. I'm pleased to sort of introduce our two guest speakers. We're going to be starting with Dr. Faisal Mullah, the University of Guelph, who's going to be sort of our lead off. And Faisal is going to sort of speak on something which I wish I knew much more about. And I've learned a lot from him, just even on Twitter. It's a wonderful little platform that way. He's going to be talking this morning about Indigenous-led conservation in the age of the Anthropocene. He'll be going from just after 9:30 here till 10:30. There'll be a 15-minute health break. Afterwards, we'll have Dr. Carly Zeter from Concordia University. We'll be talking about protecting urban nature for biodiversity and people, and she'll be going from 10:45 until 11:45. There'll be a brief wrap up after that. So that is the logistics this morning for us. And what I will be doing now is to turn over the meeting to Faisal, and he will take us in there. I will make sure that I enable your screen sharing, and Faisal, if I do not, I will make sure this happens. So technology is always fun. Once I've got that done, everybody, you'll see me mute my microphone as well as turn off my video just because it's distracting otherwise if I accidentally hit it. So Dr. Mullah, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so the one issue here is I'm trying to share my screen and I'm saying, it says here, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yes, so I'm actually about just do that. I disabled it because otherwise everybody ends up being able to do it. So.
Okay, there you are. Okay, grand.
How's that?
Yes, that's fantastic. So can you confirm that you can see my
I can see your screen.
Slide. Okay, grand. Okay, well, thank you so much, Stephen. And I've turned my camera off because I have very poor internet here in a basement apartment in Parkdale, Toronto. But it's an honor to have an opportunity to address the conference this morning. I apologize for the noise. There's a lot of construction work that's happening around me. While recognizing that the purpose of this conference is primarily focused on Ontario, I will respectfully have most of my comments referring to the Indigenous relationships that I have, that I've developed, strong friendships and partnerships that I've developed primarily in British Columbia and the traditional territories of the Denizah people, and in Mi'kmaq territories in Atlantic Canada. But my comments are, I would say, definitely applicable to the traditional territories of Indigenous nations in Ontario as well. And perhaps during the question and answer period, if anyone has any comments or questions, I might be able to address them as well. The talk that I'm going to give, I'll speak for about 45 minutes, is largely based on a series of papers that my colleagues and I have written over the last couple of years, and some forthcoming papers, really looking at the impacts of colonial conservation policy on Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada, but globally, and really articulating a path forward, which is Indigenous-led conservation governance. And so these papers have come out in journals like Biological Conservation, Environmental Reviews, more recently, in Conservation Letters. But I want to acknowledge my many co-authors and colleagues, particularly the Indigenous knowledge holders that I work with. And particularly, I want to draw attention to my wonderful late PhD student, Ganimat Asdari, who was doing her PhD on this subject. Ganimat was tragically killed in January of 2020, along with dozens of other students, faculty members, researchers who were returning from Iran back to Canada when their flight was shot down over Tehran. This was PS 752. This work that I'm going to present to you is very much inspired and a reflection of the wonderful collaboration that I had with Ganimat, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to present some of her ideas along with my own today. So several years ago, there was a paper that was published in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, which received a lot of popular attention because it essentially confirmed what most people, I think, are beginning to understand, which is that there are few places on our planet that are untouched by humans. As reported by Allison Ramankudi, more than 75% of the Earth's ice-free land surface now shows evidence of alteration as a result of human residence and land use, with less than a quarter remaining as wildlands. From Arctic tundra to primeval rainforest, this is a slide in the traditional territories of the Heiltsuk Nation in the Great Bear Rainforest, to arid desert, our natural world has been ever fragmented by ever expanding towns and cities, crisscrossed with roads, transmission lines, and pipelines, and pockmarked by pump jacks, flare stacks, and other infrastructure used to pump, frack, and strip mine fossil fuels from the ground. Indeed, the need to supply food, fiber, fuels, shelter, and fresh water to more than the 7 billion of us humans that now inhabit the planet is driving the wholesale conversion of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and other ecosystems. Satellite images taken from hundreds of kilometers above the planet reveal a world that we have irrevocably changed within a remarkably short period of time. Now, the significance of human land use was brought into sharp relief recently in a series of maps that were published by Timothy Golden, a researcher at the University of Maryland Center for International and Security Studies. Using data from the US Defense Meteorological Satellite Program at NOAA, Golden identified contiguous lighted areas worldwide. The bright spots that you see on the map before you reflect sources of light emissions at night, lit homes, powered factories, illuminated city streets, and other largely urban infrastructure, which now dominates much of the planet. Golden's maps show us how much of our planet is now under the direct influence of the human footprint, particularly due to urbanization, as well as the sprawling growth of energy infrastructure and development in formerly intact areas, such as Canada's boreal forest. Now, although industrial projects like the controversial Trans Mountain Pipeline or the defeated mega quarry in Ontario typically grab the headlines and bring out public opposition, it's often the combined impacts of a range of human activities on the same land base that threaten to drive ecosystems beyond critical tipping points. Once those thresholds are passed, rapid ecological changes, such as the extirpation of vulnerable species, can occur. Now, while this is happening all across Canada and in Ontario as well, I want to draw attention to a little known place in the northeastern part of British Columbia, which receives far less attention, but might in fact be the most impacted spot on the planet. Nowhere is this truer than in northeastern British Columbia Peace region, a vast land of boreal forest, rolling grasslands, and majestic rivers like its namesake, the Peace River. The Peace is an irreplaceable pinch point within the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor in Western North America, and as such is a conservation priority for the protection of core wildlife habitat and animal movement corridors for large migratory mammals like wolves, caribou, and endangered populations of grizzly bears. The region is also home to the Danizaa and the Cree First Nations, who have lived, hunted, and traded within the Peace Valley and across their traditional territories for well over 15,000 years. In 1899, the Danizaa in the region signed a peace and friendship treaty with the British Crown called Treaty 8. Treaty 8 enshrined a solemn and binding promise that guaranteed the Danizaa would be able to continue to practice their traditional activities like hunting, trapping, and fishing, and other practices, for as the treaty so eloquently says, quote, "For as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows." In return for the necessary consent to develop any lands in Danizaa territory, the Crown solemnly promised that the practice that Treaty 8 First Nations have continuously maintained for at least 15,000 years will be allowed to continue without forced interference or forced dependency on the Crown. Yet since signing Treaty 8, the Denizah have seen their lands irrevocably damaged by logging, oil and gas extraction, mines, dams, and other resource development. The same is happening across vast territories in Ontario as well. Across these Indigenous ancestral territories, forestry, energy, and mineral leases and licenses are now widespread and multi-layered. As various industries have exploited these tenures, a sprawling patchwork of large clear cuts, oil wells, dams and reservoirs, fracking operations, and thousands of kilometers of seismic lines, roads, and pipelines have now come to dominate the landscape. Several years ago, my colleagues and I and our Denizah First Nations partners published the first ever spatial analysis of industrial land use pressures and industrial land use change over a 56,000 square kilometer region of Denizah traditional territory. Within Denizah territory, we found that there are over 16,267 oil and gas well sites and 8,157 petroleum and natural gas facilities. There are over 45,293 kilometers of roads, including paved roads, resource roads, local roads, etc. Over 1,163 kilometers of transmission lines and 28,587 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines. 3/4 of these pipelines are currently in operation. If you placed all the pipelines, roads, and seismic lines just in Denizah territory alone, end to end, they would extend more than 4.5 times around the circumference of the Earth. When you add up all of this development, the aggregate human footprint within Denizah territories is unprecedented. In fact, the pace and scale of land use and land use change in Denizah territory probably exceeds that of other intensively managed landscapes on the continent, such as the Athabasca oil sands region in neighboring Alberta. Today, more than 65% of Denizah territory in northeastern BC has felt the impact of industrial development, leaving little intact habitat for sensitive and imperiled species such as woodland and southern mountain caribou, which are an iconic and cultural keystone species for Indigenous peoples, important to feed these communities and as well as sustain their spiritual and cultural connection to the land. For example, 5 out of 7 caribou herd ranges within Denizah territory have now been diminished by over 50% through a combination of roads, mines, settlements, pipelines, well sites, and other industrial and infrastructure activities. The burnt pine herd was extirpated in 2009, and neighboring herds are now down to less than 50 animals, despite recovery efforts by government under the Federal Species at Risk Act, include captive breeding, some habitat protection, and a controversial predator control program focused on the culling of wolves. But here's the rub, and this essentially is the basis for my talk this morning. Notwithstanding the significant impacts of land use and land use change on nature and the constraints that that places on the establishment of new parks and protected areas, we have to recognize the fact that these are having irrevocable impacts on Indigenous peoples who have called these regions home for thousands of years. For example, the Denizah people who have relied upon caribou as their primary source of food can no longer hunt them. Moose populations have also crashed, and fish in the Peace River and its tributaries have become so tainted with methyl mercury since the Peace River was dammed that they are no longer safe to consume. The loss of hunting and fishing is an infringement not just on Denizah's treaty rights, but also their Aboriginal rights that are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, as well as Canada's obligations under international conventions, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly Articles 26, 29 to 32. Now, we must remember that this dire situation didn't happen by accident or because of a laissez-faire approach to resource and land management policy in Canada. Numerous industries in the Peace region or across vast regions of Ontario are operating perfectly legally and according to the rules and regulations that have been set forth by the provincial and the federal government. But my colleagues and I believe a root cause of this problem is that our laws about land, resource, and water management are hardwired to fail Indigenous peoples as well as the environment in Canada. The narrow focus of these laws enables industries to operate in isolation from one another. For example, in British Columbia, where most of Denizah territory is found, BC has developed numerous individual laws, like the Forest and Range Practices Act, the Oil and Gas Activities Act, and the Mines Act, along with the regulated industries that they enable. But the province of British Columbia, like Ontario and other jurisdictions in Canada, lacks a legal framework to proactively and comprehensively and effectively manage the cumulative impacts of multiple resource industries operating within the same area at the same time. And that's the reason why the Denisah and other Indigenous nations, including in Ontario, are engaged in talks with the BC government and the federal government to radically overhaul the way we currently oversee and regulate the cumulative impacts of resource development within their territories, and to advance new forms of conservation stewardship, namely tribal protected areas that protect treaty and Aboriginal rights to hunt and fish, and by extension, those critical ecological and conservation values which these rights are predicated upon, such as healthy populations of wildlife and plants. Indeed, the Denisah and other First Nations, such as Grassy Narrows First Nation here in Ontario, are fighting for an Indigenous-driven approach to governing resource development and conservation in their territories that, if successful, would upend the current management paradigm in not just northeastern BC, but across Canada. It would focus on the management of the needs of the land, the water, the air, and the wildlife, and the communities that depend on them first, rather than the resources to be extracted. In practical terms, this would mean that rather than focusing on what we should take from nature to create wealth and employment and prosperity, we should first consider what we need to retain in nature to sustain both wildlife as well-being of local communities, like clean air, safe drinking water, and access to healthy traditional foods, from caribou meat to wild berries to medicinal plants. You know, one of my good friends and colleagues is Chief Roland Wilson. He's chief of one of the Denisah nations. And he once said to me, you know, sort of jokingly, he said, you know, I'll never understand why you environmentalists and scientists are, you know, so focused on the critical habitat of caribou and the critical habitat of bears and the critical habitat of wolverines and other wildlife, many of which are regulated under endangered species legislation. What about the critical habitat of Indigenous peoples? What about the spatial needs that we depend upon in order to be Indigenous, in order to have the very things that sustain the health and well-being of not just wildlife, but of our communities as well? And this was a major theme at a recent symposium on managing the cumulative impacts of resource development in the age of the Anthropocene, including how do we do conservation in highly developed landscapes like northeastern BC, as well as, you know, vast areas of the southern boreal in Ontario. Numerous speakers from First Nations to academics like myself stressed that effectively managing cumulative impacts in terms of conservation as well as resource management will require new institutions and governance mechanisms, new policy tools, that reformed mechanism, including a reformed mechanism for how we establish parks and protected areas that better reflect the priorities of Indigenous peoples. Most importantly, it will require our leaders to adopt a more proactive and holistic way of thinking about the world, one that recognizes that far from being just a place to extract resources like fossil fuels, timber, and minerals, as my favorite cartoon shows, nature is our home. Nature provides our most fundamental needs. Nature dictates limits to growth, and so its protection should be our highest priority. In 2011, Denisah community members traveled from northern BC to Victoria, the home of the British Columbia government. And they were there to deliver a declaration that was drafted by the elders calling for the establishment of a 95,000 hectare tribal protected area that would straddle the BC-Alberta border and is right in the heart of one of the biggest natural gas plays on the continent, the Montney Shale. This is a gas play which contains reserves of over 449 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and more than 1 million barrels of oil. Known as Kitsatse, which means old spruce in the Denisah or Beaver language, the area is held in great reverence by the Denisah people as a sacred place. You see, unlike most boreal forests, which are susceptible to frequent catastrophic stand-replacing fires, Kitsatse seems to have escaped large-scale fire, catastrophic in scale or intensity. As a result, the tribal park is dominated by very rare old growth stands of black spruce, which are almost unheard of anywhere else in the Peace region. On one of my recent visits, the late elder Tommy Atachi told me how he would visit the ancient spruce forests in Kitsatse as a child on horseback. There they'd hunt moose, grieve their loved ones, and heal their spirits. He told me, quote, "We've been there forever, even before they made the Alberta-BC border. We use it for healing, spiritual healing. We get healed out there and we pray. It's the last place we have for our people. It's the last place we have for our people." Indeed, Kitsatse and other proposed tribal protected areas nearby are among the few remaining places in northeastern BC where Denizah First Nations can still participate in those traditional activities that are enshrined and guaranteed to them under treaty and Aboriginal rights. Those are the activities that their ancestors did for thousands of years before Treaty 8 was signed, activities that are critical to maintaining the cultural and spiritual identity of Indigenous peoples and their connection to the land. Years of case law, as well as the 2014 Supreme Court of Canada's Chilcotin decision, have drawn attention to the fact that treaty and Aboriginal rights, enshrined by Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, are effectively meaningless if Indigenous nations don't have access to traditional lands and waterways like Kitsatse or traditional territories in Northern Ontario. The Crown must at least try to maintain the critical ecosystem services that are important to these rights so that First Nations can continue to live off healthy populations of wild game, fish, and plants. And it's for this reason that Indigenous peoples like the Denizah and other First Nations like Moose Cree or Gassi Narrows are exerting their sovereignty in protecting large swaths of their traditional territories as tribal parks and other Indigenous-led conservation areas. Kitsatse is unique in that it's being established on land that is subject to treaty, unlike other tribal parks, like Dugut's Tribal Park, which was established by the Council of the Haida Nation in 1981, or Mares Island Tribal Park that was declared by the Colloquiet First Nation in 1984, but has still never been given any provincial or federal recognition. Dasyko Tribal Park was declared by the Chilcotin National Government after they won title in a groundbreaking Supreme Court decision in 2014. It still remains threatened by industrial mining. Grassy Narrows First Nation in Ontario have declared their entire traditional territory as an Indigenous sovereignty and protected area, pursuant to their inherent rights to self-determination. The Grassy Narrows First Nations government has declared the Indigenous sovereignty and protected area following the Conservative government of Ontario's decision to open up the north to industrial logging. More recently, a groundbreaking coalition of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have come together to advance Indigenous Guardians programs across the country with the goal of empowering Indigenous communities to manage ancestral lands and waters according to traditional laws and values. The Indigenous Guardians Network received an initial investment of $25 million in the 2017-2018 federal budget. The Government of Canada announced a further $340 million in new funding just this past August over the next 5 years, and that's there to support Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship. This investment includes more than $173 million for Indigenous Guardians programs and to support the First Nations National Guardians Network, and $166 million for Indigenous protected and conserved areas such as tribal parks. The funding is part of the Budget 2021's historic $2.3 billion commitment to nature conservation.
The guardianship program is a huge step for us because it's about preserving the land and preserving culture and preserving language. It's an essential thing to our community.
A guardian acts as the eyes and ears in each respective territory. They ensure that everybody's following all the rules and regulations that are placed in all the GUI laws, our laws.
We go out and monitor tourist activities, industry activities, fisheries, commercial and sporting. We also do environmental monitoring.
A huge aspect of it is healing and getting back in touch with your Indigenous self. If there's healthy people that are happy and strong in their culture, and if they receive that from being on the land, then it's a huge investment. You're investing in a better society and a better tomorrow.
In 1973, I paddled on my own all the way down to Skungwai. All my life, I always heard it as a very strong spiritual place. There's so much brush and debris and everything all over when I got there. It is just totally overgrown. So I took upon myself to start clearing the village, just trying to show the ancestors that somebody cared.
Our land is very important to us. We live on it, we breathe it, we work on it. It gives us life. Without it, we don't have an identity.
The best part of being a guardian is being out on the land where your ancestors have lived for many centuries, and just to reconnect with Mother Nature and how your people lived off the land.
There's a gap between the youth and the elders. By starting this program, it's trying to bridge that gap, trying to create that spark to carry on the knowledge.
We are sustaining our traditional territory not only for us, but for the whole world. Our ecosystem is so pure, we have so many trees, that we are cleaning up a lot of pollution. It means that we are here protecting Mother Earth in order for the rest of the world to live on her.
The Guardians Network, tribal parks, and other forms of mechanisms of Indigenous conservation governance are critical because conservation policy, in particular, the establishment of parks and protected areas, has long played a central role in the displacement of Indigenous communities from their traditional territory in Canada and around the world. Study after study has documented the alienation of Indigenous peoples from important food sources, cultural sites, and lively activities in the name of conservation. These negative social and ecological effects are directly linked to a particularly colonial form of protected area, one which is rooted in notions of wilderness as being necessarily uninhabited, of management expertise as being exclusively informed by Western science, and of Indigenous people as unequipped to manage for the conservation values of their own traditional territories. Thus, it's fair to say that state-managed parks and protected areas are part of the very fabric of colonialism, because they have helped to serve as a means by which colonial and modern settler nation states establish and maintain control over Indigenous territories. Now, it's a very uncomfortable thing, but it's actually true, which is that Canada particularly struggles with a legacy of colonial conservation policy. Many of the country's national, provincial, and territorial protected areas were established without any regard whatsoever to Indigenous rights or treaty, and they displaced the Indigenous peoples that lived there, resulting in the loss of livelihood and access to spiritual sites. Writing in the Walrus magazine, Indigenous writer Robert Jago has even referred to Canada's network of protected areas somewhat cheekily as colonial crime scenes, owing to their forced displacement and alienation of Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories in the name of conservation. Jago writes, quote, "The places Canada has made into parks are filled with our own stories. Every mountain, every valley has a name, a history for Indigenous peoples. It is those places that our history is alive." In his article for The Walrus, Jago offers examples of how Indigenous peoples have been marched off their lands to facilitate the establishment of protected areas, which are celebrated today as much loved representations of our outdoorsy, wilderness-loving Canadian culture. This includes the ban on Native peoples in Banff National Park, enacted by Canada's first Superintendent of Parks, George Stewart, in 1885, to the murder of unarmed Indigenous activist Dudley George in 1995, by police following the Indigenous reoccupation of traditional territories that had been previously expropriated for the creation of Ipperwash Provincial Park. Over the last decade, the international conservation community has begun to recognize the often devastating impact of colonial parks and protected areas policy on Indigenous peoples, and thankfully has begun to move away from the conventional notion that parks are best managed by bureaucrats and scientists towards a growing commitment to incorporate Indigenous people, their worldviews, their rights, and knowledge into conservation governance. For example, the UN's International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has expanded the number of protected areas management categories to now include areas where human habitation and use has occurred with their Indigenous and community conserved areas designation, recognizing that these areas are governed by Indigenous and local communities and they have conservation significance. Indeed, there is a growing global recognition that Indigenous protected areas and other forms of conservation governance by Indigenous peoples can be more successful in achieving conservation outcomes than state regulated processes. For example, in the Amazon, where forest ecosystems face tremendous development pressure, researchers have found that Indigenous lands are particularly effective at curbing high deforestation pressure relative to both strictly protected and managed areas. These findings were confirmed in a global study of 14 of the most heavily forested countries in the tropic, which attempted to determine what type of governance is best for reducing deforestation. The study by the World Resources Institute found that land held by local communities and Indigenous peoples tended to be significantly less impacted by deforestation than land managed by government or private entities or NGOs. Now, thankfully, Parks Canada, who I work very closely with, as well as provincial and other territorial parks agencies, have committed to a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples in the establishment of new parks and protected areas under something called the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process. Now, this is a federal initiative in collaboration with territories and provinces and Indigenous nations, ostensibly meant to help Canada achieve its international and domestic obligations to protect a minimum of 17% of terrestrial and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas through networks of protected areas and what are called other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. Now, I should just flag here that the targets that you see on this slide are being revised in advance of the UN Biodiversity Conference at COP15 in Kunming, China. Now, significantly, the Pathway 1 process involves First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and commits to engaging both Western and Indigenous knowledge systems in parks, protected areas planning, and management. As part of this process, the Indigenous Circle of Experts delivered to the federal and provincial and territorial governments recommendations on how Indigenous-led conservation activities can help Canada to enhance and expand its existing protected areas network while advancing nation-to-nation reconciliation. As Stephen Nita, a member of the ICE leadership team and also an Indigenous leader from the Northwest Territories, Dene, has spoken, Stephen said, quote, "Creating protected areas with Canadians on Indigenous lands is a step towards reconciliation." Indeed, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has emphasized the critical importance of reconciliation to redress the historical and ongoing negative impacts of colonial policy on Indigenous peoples and their lands and territories. Under the leadership of Senator Murray Sinclair, the TRC has offered 94 policy recommendations under a call to action to all Canadians that are purposely broad in scope and breadth and touch on all areas of Canadian society, including conservation. As my friend Caleb Ben, who's a Denizah hunter and lawyer, reminds us, quote, "There cannot be reconciliation without justice." And I believe it's critical that we recognize the detrimental legacy of colonialism in Canada, including conservation policy, and that we support Indigenous nations as decision makers over their own lands and waters, be it for resource development or for conservation. The TRC has explicitly called on all sectors of Canadian society to embrace reconciliation grounded in international best practices such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I believe it behooves us to ensure that fostering reconciliation is at the heart of our efforts to better engage with Indigenous communities and nations in conservation and other types of environmental stewardship. For as Senator Murray Sinclair has so eloquently written in the TRC's final report, quote, Reconciliation not only requires apologies, reparations, the relearning of Canada's national history and public commemoration, but also needs real social, political, and economic change. Ongoing public education and dialogue are essential to reconciliation. Governments, churches, educational institutions, and Canadians from all walks of life are responsible for taking action on reconciliation in concrete ways, working collaboratively with Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation begins with each and every one of us. I'll say that again. Reconciliation begins with each and every one of us. Essentially, what Senator Sinclair is saying is we cannot defer to governments to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We have to advance reconciliation in the work that we do, and that includes conservation, especially the establishment of parks and protected areas, as well as their management. Already, a vast array of governments, educational institutions, philanthropic organizations, labor, and other elements of civil society, including universities, have taken the challenge to heart and have begun to reform their policies, programs, and practices to promote reconciliation is a key goal of Indigenous engagement. And I'm very happy to see that the conservation sector is beginning to reorient itself to working more effectively and equitably and ethically with Indigenous nations in support of conservation, guided by best practices like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Earlier this year, political leaders, including our own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, met under the auspices at the Convention of Biological Diversity to launch the UN Biodiversity Summit, which is a critical step in the eventual negotiation of what some people are referring to as a new deal for nature. This is going to be an international agreement to stem the catastrophic decline in biodiversity and the critical ecosystem services that we all depend upon. Dozens of heads of state, financial institutions, and non-governmental organizations have called for bold action to protect and restore biodiversity, including Canada's Prime Minister, who is committed to protecting 25% of Canada's land and 25% of the country's oceans by 2025, and hitting the 30% mark on both fronts by 2030. Now, past experience indicates this is going to be an uphill battle. The Convention on Biological Diversity reports that neither Canada nor any country achieved all of the previous 20 global biodiversity targets, which expired in 2020, and that included the expansion of parks and protected areas networks. What is clear to me is that decolonizing conservation through supporting Indigenous-led conservation activities like tribal parks and Indigenous guardian programs is going to be critical to the success of any future global conservation agreement. Some estimates indicate that over 80% of the world's biodiversity is found within Indigenous lands and lands managed under customary forms of governance, most often without recognition or support by NGOs or state actors. Therefore, recognizing and upholding the land rights of Indigenous peoples, incorporating their sophisticated traditional ecological knowledge in conservation science and policy and practice, and investing in the capacity of Indigenous peoples to protect their lands and waters under their own governance systems, like Indigenous protected conserved areas or tribal parks or guardians programs, as well as upholding Indigenous laws, is critical to the future of conservation on the planet. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm done and happy to answer any questions, or if you have any comments or criticisms, concerns about anything that I've said. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mula. Steve Murphy coming back in and moderating the conference here. The floor will be open to questions. I have allowed people to unmute themselves. If you are, however, having any trouble trying to ask a question, you can also send me a message in the chat, but you should be able to unmute yourselves and ask Dr. Mula any questions that you wish. So the floor is open to anyone who wishes to start.
People are shy, and
they may be. I can certainly ask questions, but I prefer to let
I could ask the audience a question.
You could ask me. Why don't you do that? Actually, that makes some sense.
Okay. So maybe I could ask if anyone here who's listening, because I know we have representatives from provincial and territorial and federal governments and NGOs and academics. Is anyone here beginning to sort of reorient their conservation activities to work directly with Indigenous nations? And maybe can anyone give an example of what they're doing right now, perhaps inspired by some of the things that I remarked upon this morning.
Whether I have a very shy audience or people are a little nervous.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. And, you know, I also do acknowledge that perhaps some of what I've said is hopefully not received in a provocative way. I really honestly feel that as a conservation community, as that we need to imagine a different future when it comes to how we establish parks and protected areas and how we management those areas. I'll mention, and then I'm just going to respond to what Ed has written, that I was trained as a traditional conservation biologist. I did my undergraduate degree, master's, and PhD in the early 2000s, and I'm embarrassed to say that despite attending some of the best universities in Canada, I had absolutely no exposure to Indigenous peoples, but more critically, I had no exposure to Indigenous governance systems, the importance of treaty rights, the importance of natural law, for example, where a lot of Indigenous governance derives from. I know this is changing. You know, at the University of Guelph, for example, I teach a number of courses that integrate both Indigenous conservation governance and state-led environmental policy. And we're really lucky at the University of Guelph and in many universities across Canada that there's been a real resurgence in the hiring of Indigenous scientists and other knowledge keepers who are leading much of this work. And so it's my hope that young people who have interest in conservation policy might want to get involved in parks planning or work for the park system, that they will have the sort of exposure to some of the things that I've talked about today, which I think are really critically necessary if we're going to do conservation well. So I know Ed has mentioned that that he's involved in some activities, but can't sort of speak to them because of the fact that they are in negotiations, presumably with the Indigenous nations that are involved in that conservation effort. But is there any other examples that people can talk about or would like to share, or perhaps you'd like to be involved in terms of Indigenous guardians?
Brian has actually mentioned something. Brian, if you want to unmute
Brilliant.
yourself and to share this with us, that's fine. It's in the chat. You can see it. That's up to you, Brian. I'm not trying to put any pressure on you.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot to add. I don't want to scoop myself in terms of the story. So, but it's an element of a bigger story, but it fits very much in with what Faisal was talking about. So I thought I'd mention it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
And that's, I know a little bit about the Ktunaxa, and that's really inspiring because the Ktunaxa Nation have declared their intent to establish an Indigenous protected and conserved area within their traditional territories that would also protect critical habitat of very sensitive and vulnerable species, most notably grizzly bears.
Indeed. Will and Tammy both shared ones, and again, I don't pressure either one of you, but if you wish to elaborate, you have the floor if you wish. So don't feel shy, but if you wish to keep it in the chat, that's fine.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Tammy. Maybe I could add a further reflection that I would love if anyone has any thoughts about. So, you know, I was trained as a conservation biologist. You know, my PhD was in botany. I worked on ericaceous plant species and the impacts of forestry and conservation activities on them. And one of the things that I recognized as I began to pivot my own career and my academic work, working with Indigenous peoples, was the fact that many of the plants and animals that motivate us in terms of conservation, you know, oftentimes we tend to pay a lot of attention to those species that are at risk or that are rare, or where there's a regulatory obligation to manage them under, say, the Federal Species at Risk Act or some other piece of legislation. There's an entire suite of plants and animals which my mentor, the great ethnobotanist Nancy Turner, has referred to as cultural keystone species. And cultural keystone species oftentimes include plants or animals that don't meet the ecological or conservation threshold for regulatory action, so they tend to get ignored. And those include things like wild blueberry, for example, or many of the other teaberry and Labrador tea, many of the other plants and animals that Indigenous peoples rely upon for food, for sustenance, for medicine, for culture and spiritual reasons. And you know, this is a new emerging area of Indigenous conservation governance that I think people need to be aware of, is that there's a real effort abreast by Indigenous peoples to begin to protect these cultural keystone species and these cultural keystone places where these plants and animals are found, because of concern that while they may be very common and while they may not be at risk and could be found, you know, elsewhere on the landscape, having close accessibility to them is really, really critical. So protecting like a traditional berry picking area, for example. The other thing is that it's not just important to protect the cultural keystone species or the cultural keystone places where those species are found, but it's also really important to protect the cultural keystone practices that Indigenous peoples have developed over thousands of years, which are critical to the stewardship of the environment. And that most notably includes the cultural use of fire. And as you know, colonial policy has in many ways suppressed the use of fire by Indigenous peoples, notwithstanding the fact that many parks agencies, including Parks Canada, who I work with very closely, are involved in trying to bring back the cultural use of fire in some of their national parks. And we have a paper that's going to be coming out shortly with a Métis scientist and cultural fire knowledge holder, Amy Christensen, and it really talks about the importance of the cultural use of fire as a cultural keystone practice in the stewardship of conservation. So yeah, thank you, Kim. I really appreciate your comments as well.
Circling back, it's again, I meet a couple of folks who look like they may want to actually contribute here. By all means, on sort of the previous issue that Dr. Moule has just raised, but also sort of in some of the examples, you're more than welcome to take the floor. Tammy, did you wish to elaborate there?
Sure. Thank you very much. This has been fantastic. I just wanted to let you know too that in our action planning for species at risk that goes on at Parks Canada now, at Point Pelee National Park where I work, we're just in the process of renewing a 5-year multi-species action plan for our 64 species at risk. And the process has changed drastically since I did a first action plan 5 years ago. And now we are absolutely encouraged and given guidance on how to engage our Indigenous partners on identifying those culturally significant species, keystone species, and actually consulting and working with them right from the beginning on all of the different measures that we try to develop to recover our species at risk. And I know through working with Ontario Parks that they're adopting that into their practices that are going on right now too. The question that I had was, in kind of renewed work that we're doing at Point Pelee and working with Caldwell First Nation and Walpole First Nation, Island First Nation, often we aren't finding any real barriers to working together to really protect the lands and protect the culture and protect the keystone species. Sometimes when things are proposed, such as traditional harvesting of anything from eagle feathers to things within the park, it's not an issue of, like you said, there's really no problem because their practices are not going to harm the park. We're not concerned, but can you give any insight in how we use education and how we work with the public that says we're not allowed to do certain things in parks, and yet people are, and how do we kind of protect that tradition of them being able to do traditional harvest or to do things and yet try to mediate that relationship with the public? I think that's one of the concerns I'm having and seeing, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that at all as part of a kind of a barrier to us working more closely on traditional practices in our national parks in these really heavily populated areas in southwestern Ontario.
Yeah, no, I am I have heard about that, and I know it can be particularly challenging. I don't have a lot of experience to share with you. I mean, I work predominantly with Terra Nova National Park in Newfoundland and with Mi'apokek First Nation, and it would just absolutely shock me to find out, for example, that you can't pick berries within the national park. But at the same time, Parks Canada has, you know, moved wonderfully forward to establish a moose hunting program. So now band members can harvest moose within the national park. I think that this sort of speaks to perhaps the importance of having more Indigenous people working for the parks agencies and being the point of contact with the public. I think there's a real need to re-narrate the conservation story in Canada, because the conservation story in Canada has been told in one way only, and Indigenous peoples have largely been erased from that conservation story. For example, you know, we don't hear about the fact that Indigenous peoples, that their traditional territories were the lands upon which these parks and protected areas were established, or that these were the hunting grounds for Indigenous peoples, or places where they were harvesting medicinal plants and such. So I think if there's any hope, I really like what Casiopa National Park is doing. They've got a gentleman there who's on site, and he's making these beautiful birch bark canoes. And so the visitors can interact with him and talk to him and even learn about the practice of using birch bark. Somebody mentioned black ash. That's a very important and very highly threatened tree in large areas of Mi'kmaq territory where there's some effort as well. So maybe I didn't really answer your question, but I would say that what I would suggest is we have to have more Indigenous people in the parks, hired by the parks agencies, leading the public education activities, so that the public can learn directly from Indigenous people on the importance of these lands to their communities. And that's definitely how I learned, because like I think there was a student that put in the chat box that they're not getting very much exposure to Indigenous peoples in their schooling. I didn't get any exposure to Indigenous peoples in my undergrad, master's, or PhD. It was only when on my own volition, I just started visiting communities and found it to be a very enlightening process, and then made the commitment that I will only work with Indigenous partners. And I've learned so much, and my students have learned so much from that experience. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
The floor is open, colleagues. Are there any other questions? We have about 7 minutes to the break. And thank you for all the interesting stuff in the chat box as well. It's very enlightening, actually. Dr. Moule, I'll ask one of you, because you have much more experience than I do. Mine is very scattered and almost familial. That is to say, relationships I've had have primarily been because my larger families interacted deeply, but in some cases, but I can't claim the same. Do you sense any exhaustion among some of your First Nation partners, for example? Because, I mean, there's a certain extent of, I almost feel like we're vampiric, not you personally, but, you know, those of us in the area, of almost over sort of asking our partners to sort of in there, or do you feel that, you know, we just don't ask enough? I mean, I'm never too sure where we are on that. Your experience would be far more valuable than mine.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think one of the things that people need to know, that if you are approaching an Indigenous nation, say you are approaching the nation through the chief or the band council members, or it could be community members, the first thing to recognize is that people are super, super busy and super overwhelmed with so many responsibilities. You know, the Indigenous governments are dealing with everything from stray dogs to dealing with youth, to dealing with the provision of critical services to the community. And so your priority to do, you know, a research project, or maybe you want to talk to an Indigenous nation about soliciting their support for a conservation idea, in my experience, will always interest people, but the timelines may not necessarily align to your timeline. So what I have chosen to do, and my students do this, is that, you know, we are really, really careful to, well, we don't do any work without the permission and support of the Indigenous peoples that on whose territories that we're working. And we've really been really cautious about presenting opportunities in a way that is not going to overburden people that are already super, super busy. But I would add that, if I can be so bold, don't feel intimidated, don't feel scared. In my experience, the Indigenous peoples that I've worked with over the last 30 years have all been incredibly generous, incredibly kind, incredibly interested in sharing their stories, and walking with you on their land. It's been a remarkable experience for myself and for my students. I would definitely have to say that I, as an individual, have been changed through that opportunity of developing those relationships that have shifted very quickly into very strong friendships as well.
Excellent, and thanks Rob Davis, who's in the chat, actually, one of our big supporters of Casiopa in here. Also somebody who's actually worked on the Path to Target one, for example. Rob, did you want to say anything publicly? And I don't want to put you in the spot, but say anything you wanted to add, go right ahead, please.
Thank you. I was just trying
sorry,
to
Rob.
find my
sorry, Rob. Go ahead.
No, I was just trying to find my unmute button. No, I think I said it in the comments there. It's you know, I think we're all aware. Generally, there's so much more growing awareness of, you know, the fundamental relationship changes that are taking place, right? And this talk is really good at sort of catalyzing that and bringing it all together. There are so many good initiatives taking place in Ontario and across the country. And yet we still have so far to go and so much to learn, right? And Faisal, you've provided some real kind of soul-searching comments that I think a lot of us can relate to about the, you know, the upbringing and education that we got, and you know, our own continued development as practitioners, rather than back in the student phase. We're clearly all still learning and growing on the subject.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Well, I'm gonna end, but I would just like to share with you very quickly. So if you are interested in learning more, there are wonderful Indigenous organizations and nations that are advancing everything that I talked about. So the key people and organizations to follow is, there's something called the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. The ILI is an Indigenous organization, pan-Indigenous organization, that's leading the work on Indigenous guardians. There's something called the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. The Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, of which I'm a member, is an Indigenous-led organization that is working to reform conservation policy and practice. There are a lot of Indigenous folks that are on Twitter as well. I want to draw particular attention to a colleague of mine by the name of Danica Littlechild. Danica is a lawyer at Carleton, and she's really working on trying to address some of these more holistic things that I talked about, which, you know, as scientists, perhaps we are a little bit uncomfortable kind of grappling with, because perhaps we're so prescriptive in our training. But she's really been looking at how to integrate sort of Indigenous knowledge systems into policy, particularly parks and protected areas policy, under something called ethical space and something else called two-eyed seeing. So Danica Littlechild, the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership are a really great place to learn more. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And if you would like, please shoot me an email or let's connect on Twitter, for example. But I'm now looking forward to hearing Carly's presentation. So thanks a lot. Have a great morning, everybody.
Dr. Mula, thank you so much for joining us. At the honor is ours, and I appreciate you and all, of course, your partners who've worked on the research. We will take a break for 15 minutes. I will pause the recording, so you don't have to worry about being recorded while you're running around or anything like that. We will be back at 10:45 with Dr. Zeter, and she will actually then lead us off from there. The recording will resume at that time. So take yourselves 15 minutes to do anything you need to do, and then we'll be back. Once again, Dr. Mula, thank you. There we go. I'm pleased actually to introduce Dr. Carly Zeter once again. We did it at the beginning, but I want to do it again because we're just now picking up after the break, 15 minutes. Dr. Zeter is going to talk about protecting urban nature for biodiversity and people. She has started, well, not recently now, but for, during the pandemic in terms of Concordia University. And I appreciate having somebody so wonderful and eloquent here as both of our guest speakers. It's nice to have Dr. Zeter sort of who has really made a name for herself already with the entire sort of urban thread as well as so much more. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Zeter, and I should have the screen sharing in. If I do not hesitate to remind me, but it should be active. So the floor is yours.
Okay, it looks like I do have my screen sharing here. Let me just start this. And you should be seeing, you're seeing my slides, what you're supposed to be seeing?
We are indeed, or at least I am anyway.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. As Dr. Murphy mentioned, I am a relatively new, I'm still holding on to that new moniker, prophet at Concordia University, where I've been for the last, just over the last 2 years. And I, like Faisal, got my start in research as a kind of traditional, field ecologist. I developed my love for ecology, working in the field. As an undergrad at Guelph, I was fortunate to work with really incredible aquatic and terrestrial systems. I did a master's degree in Quebec, exploring working landscapes, measuring trees. And throughout my PhD, I, and now my students, transitioned to really working in sites that, that looks a little more like this. So we've traded these wilder or working landscapes for the living landscapes that make up our cities and towns. And that brought me to my current role, where I wear a few different hats. I am a faculty member in our Department of Biology, where I lead an urban landscape ecology lab full of a whole bunch of wonderful students here. And I'm also a member of our very interdisciplinary cities cluster, where we collaborate across disciplines, so across engineering, physics, fine arts, philosophy, to think about cities of the future and what those cities should look like. And within my lab, my students and I are really interested in how we can better understand a broad variety of urban green spaces, kind of the ecological fabric of our cities, to both enhance biodiversity conservation, but also provide ecosystem services, which I'm using broadly to mean the benefits we receive from nature or the many different ways that we value nature. And perhaps maybe an overly simplified way of thinking about the work that we do is that on the one hand, we think about the ways that cities, or more accurately, the people who live in cities, need nature. And on the flip side, how can nature benefit from the ways that we manage our urban ecosystems? And of course, when do these two go together and when might they not? And we do this work using a variety of methods, from more traditional field ecology to advanced sensor networks and technological approaches to community science. I'm showing just a snapshot of some of our lab's work here. And you might have noticed that these examples I'm giving don't really focus on protected areas. And that's because to understand the ecological fabric of our cities, we need to understand what's happening at many scales, including areas outside the park. And that's actually often the title of talks that I give. It's literally like thinking outside the park. And so when Dr. Murphy reached out to ask me to give this talk on urban parks and protected areas, I got a little imposter syndrome. I talk about backyards and landscape mosaics and how urban nature is really this all hands on deck situation that can't be relegated solely to one type of green space. But of course, parks and protected areas do play a critical role in this ecological fabric of our cities. And while spending the last 6 or so years thinking and reading about urban ecology and how we can build more resilient, more equitable cities, it turns out I've picked up some thoughts and opinions on protected areas along the way. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you, but I won't be relying much on our lab's primary data here, but rather bringing in broader perspectives from the field and drawing from some larger initiatives I'm really excited to be involved in around urban parks and equitable cities. And hopefully this will stimulate some conversation, some questions among those of you in the audience who I know actually work more directly on this topic in many cases than I do. And because I so often talk about non-protected areas, I thought I'd start off by reacquainting myself with some of the basics. And so at the risk of starting off with a giant cliche here, Casiopa defines a protected area in line with the common UN definition many of us know. These are clearly defined geographical spaces, recognized, dedicated, and managed to achieve long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So far, so good. This is very much in line with how I think about urban parks. And the second part of that is protected areas can support a variety of uses, but must have the in situ conservation of biodiversity as their primary objective. And that got me thinking about, is this actually the right primary objective for an urban protected area? I still don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to try and work through some of those thoughts here with you today. And if it is, if biodiversity conservation is our ultimate goal, how can we achieve this in these very urban parts of our country? And so in broad strokes today, what I'd like to talk about are some of the challenges and opportunities of nearby nature, including the benefits of urban parks and protected areas for people, the potential of urban parks and protected areas for biodiversity conservation, and whether those two go together or we might have to choose. And although this might be expected for an Ontario-based talk, I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming at this from the perspective of a researcher in the global north who works mostly in northern cities. And this kind of limited geographical focus is a well-known bias in urban biodiversity studies, like much ecology research. Here we see it highlighted as kind of a cross-cutting issue for urban biodiversity. And so, of course, there might be very different challenges, very different opportunities surrounding urban protected areas in a broader geographic context that we won't necessarily get into today in this particular talk. Okay, so now that I've given a little bit of context where I'm coming from, where my position is, let's talk about urban nature, my very favorite topic to talk about. And I think it's pretty safe to say that urban nature is really having a moment right now, much more broadly than just in the protected areas discourse. If you were to look at my bookshelf at home, you'd see a number of books about urban ecology and biodiversity. And these aren't textbooks, although I have some of those on my shelf too. These are recent popular science books written for anyone interested in urban nature. And what this tells me is there is a huge appetite out there for information on the plants and animals surrounding us where most of us live. And to me, and I suspect many others, the reason that this kind of ecology, this urban ecology, is so popular and so important right now is that we live in an increasingly urban world. I love that Faisal used the same image in his talk, which really symbolizes the fact that urban land use is among the fastest growing land use classes worldwide. And I think often ecologists show this figure to show the, the damage and the destruction that really we've caused on the planet. But these also represent a lot of places that people live and that people love, and where there's some really incredible changes happening in terms of how we relate to nature. And so for the first time in history right now, more than half of our planet's population is urban, more like 80% here in Canada. And many scientists, myself included, have really been grappling with what this rapid urbanization means for biodiversity and for ecosystem services. So where and how do we conserve nature in an urban world? And I'm going to pull a few figures from this Nature in the Urban Century assessment that many of us worked on a few years ago. And on a global scale, we know that urbanization presents some serious challenges. We're building the equivalent of a city with the population of London, England, every few months. These cities will sprawl into natural habitat, releasing carbon, damaging some of our vulnerable coastal regions. And this is typically the narrative that we hear, right? Urbanization is a major threat to biodiversity, to nature. Now, in many cases, these urban areas are expanding into agricultural land or other lands that are already heavily modified by people. But we did find that urban growth would also result in a significant loss of natural habitat around the world, an area approximately equivalent to Italy or the Philippines, larger than New Zealand, and that's in the next 2 decades. And alongside that urban growth, a challenge that we often hear about is that urban areas are infringing on protected areas. As we urbanize, we're extending our cities closer and closer to existing protected land. And these, I should have been prepared to put a link in the chat. Maybe I can share it later, but all of these maps are things that you can click on and explore and look around the world yourself to see that in many parts of the world, our protected areas are closer to cities. There's an increase in urban adjacent PAs. And that brings with it increased challenges for biodiversity. For example, damage from recreation and trails, foraging or removal of wild plants, increased supplemental food or junk food for wildlife. And these aren't issues specific to urban areas, of course, but they're heightened with this increased proximity to people and higher rates of visitation and use. Urban protected areas are also disproportionately affected by crime, by vandalism, by littering, light and noise pollution. They're subject to what we sometimes call urban edge effects, like more frequent and more severe fires or air and water pollution, and introduction of invasive species as well. So just as Faisal mentioned in his talk, cumulative effects on a much broader landscape scale, we see the same kind of death by 1,000 cuts at a smaller scale as well in these highly used urban green spaces. And invasive species in particular are something that you in Ontario are increasingly a leader in as home to the Global Urban Biological Invasion Consortium at UT Scarborough. And so there are undoubtedly challenges. I acknowledge that, and I understand why ecologists are concerned about this increase in urban adjacent protected areas because we suddenly have to contend with these additional threats. But as an urban ecologist who focuses not only on biodiversity, but on the value, the benefits of nature for communities, this perspective has always made me a little uncomfortable that we see this interaction of urbanization and nature as kind of a negative space. We come at this from the perspective of urbanization and people being this unwelcome or damaging force in our protected areas. But urban areas are also where most people interact with nature most often. So isn't it also a good thing if high quality nature is becoming more accessible to people? And I'll mention here that my own perspectives on this have really been shaped and challenged in recent years by interacting across disciplines. So for example, in a recent national workshop, we have this beautiful art by Claire Brascoupé for this workshop on equitable cities for healthy people and nature that brought together ecologists, other academics, practitioners, community leaders, Indigenous leaders across a range of fields. And I think sometimes we need to get out of our kind of ecological or conservation bubbles and see a wider picture. And I also love this quote from Dan Kraus from NCC, which echoes one of the reasons I'm so drawn to urban ecology, which is that our cities are one of the few ecosystems where the state of nature is often improving. Cities offer so much more than this idea of trashed or damaged habitat. They're increasingly a space where we are doing better. And this improved nature and improved access to urban nature can help fight what scientists sometimes call the extinction of experience, or the lack of connection between people and nature. And you probably can't see this very well, so I'm going to zoom in on one of these panels here from a study out of the UK about 5 years ago, where they looked at the number of people in a city who had never experienced a range of activities, the number of children in particular who had never experienced, for example, mountaineering, climbing trees, fishing, catching insects, who had never gone bird watching. And from 1998 to 2009, those numbers have gone up across the board. But there's no reason that we can't get most of these experiences in the cities where we live. I mean, maybe we're not going to go mountaineering in Southern Ontario or Saskatchewan, but certainly you can catch insects, you can birdwatch in the majority, if not all, of our Canadian cities. So access to parks and protected areas can contribute directly to the nature-based experiences people have growing up. And I was really struck as I was reading and preparing for this talk by this quote from Joanne Willock, who was a parent volunteer at Rouge National Urban Park in Toronto, where she talked about, all these housing developments around here. They're called Valley this and Valley that, but you lose sight of what a real valley is. And she was speaking about her son on a visit, his first visit to the park. And she said he's 9, and this is the first time he's walked in a river. So can we increase these experiences people are having with nature by increasing our protection of nature in proximity to where we live? And this connection is really important for those of us who care about nature more broadly, who care about conservation on a broad scale. Because as it turns out, these really ordinary nature experiences of fishing and bug catching and tree climbing can help foster a connection to nature that helps conservation much more broadly. We sometimes call this the pigeon paradox, the idea that even interacting with a humble pigeon can help build our connection with the natural world. And maybe you don't love pigeons, but researchers also sometimes call this the butterfly affect. So many of us are familiar with chaos theory, where the butterfly effect is a term for a situation where small changes may have large effects. So the eventual path of a tornado is influenced by the distant flapping of butterfly wings. So the butterfly affect then refers to the influence and impact of everyday nature on our emotions. So when we notice simple things like a passing butterfly or a singing bird, that affects our emotions. And this is a small step towards nature connectedness, mental well-being, and pro-nature behaviors. So in a survey of 1,300 UK adults, the authors assessed a range of individual characteristics, demographics, different types of nature experiences, different knowledge and attitudes, pro-environmental behaviors. And together, all of the things they looked at explained about 70% of variation in the actions people took for nature. And engaging in simple nature activities emerged as the largest significant contributor to pro-nature conservation behavior. So moments noticing butterflies or listening to bird song can explain pro-nature behaviors people have. And of course, we've seen that these also can influence mental health. During the lockdowns, during COVID, noticing nature explained higher levels of well-being, for example. Beyond increasing our connections to nature, which is really connected with a broader conservation ethos, nearby nature also brings clear health and well-being benefits, in situ for those who can access it. Or in other words, it provides essential ecosystem services. This is much more where my work lies. How do we actually map and measure these benefits that we get from nature in our cities, like cooler temperatures, improved air quality, reduced noise and flooding. And these can be physical health benefits. Improved air quality and temperature regulation have significant effects on our physical health. A recent study in Philadelphia found that meeting the city's canopy targets of 30% would prevent an estimated 400 deaths per year. And this reduced mortality is found broadly across many studies, where looking at systemic reviews or meta-analyses, green spaces contribute to reduced mortality across the board. Or as the CNN article puts it, urban dwellers who live near green spaces are less likely to die early. And health, of course, includes mental health. We've seen this firsthand in the last 2 years. And there's a wonderful survey by Parks people that showed that 70% of surveyed Canadians said their appreciation for parks and green spaces has increased during COVID, and that parks and green spaces are vital to people's mental health and well-being. And I think many of us intrinsically understand that being around nature makes us feel better, but we're increasingly seeing stronger and stronger scientific studies supporting these relationships. And while many of these findings about the benefits of urban nature have been known in some capacity for many years, I think we're really at a critical moment in terms of urban nature advocacy. We saw it during COVID, article after article on the power of parks and the need to keep parks open. We're also realizing much more broadly, or perhaps realizing isn't the right word, acknowledging the inequities embedded in who has access to urban nature. This inequality in access to green space and in access to green space of a certain quality was already well known in urbanism and environmental spheres, but it's now entering broader public awareness due to COVID. So I've seen an incredible number of articles such as this one lately that really highlight not only the lack of green space, but the inequities in who has access, who lives in leafy biodiverse areas, who doesn't, who feels welcome and safe in our parks, who doesn't. And this is an area that we're still really beginning to explore and understand better in Canada in particular. Much of the research in this area at broad scales has happened in other parts of the world, in the US in particular. And as a brief aside here, if this is an area that you're interested in, we're working on understanding these patterns of who has access to parks much more broadly across Canada, not just in urban areas, but all parks and recreation areas across the country with the ParkSeek project, which is a national collaboration on access to nature and population health consequences, where we're looking not only at geographic accessibility, but the experiential quality and the infrastructure available in different parks and how this relates to policy. So stay tuned for more information on that. But without having done this analysis, I think we already all know, anyone paying attention over the last years can see that we have a major equity problem in who is welcome and supported in enjoying the outdoors. Some of you maybe were aware or participated in Black Birders Week or other initiatives to raise awareness about these systemic injustices in nature and fields of ecology and conservation generally. And certainly these are things that occur in our cities. And so I think we need to think about how urban protected areas may be part of the solution as we move forward, especially since urban protected areas tend to reach more diverse audiences than remote protected areas. They receive large numbers of visitors compared to remote protected areas. So is this a place where we can start closing this equity gap and start readjusting our perceptions of who belongs in nature, who deserves access to nature? And I want to tie back to Faisal's wonderful talk this morning. Urban parks as expressions of culture have potential to be a key location for reconciliation as well. sometimes as urban ecologists, we seem to let ourselves off the hook when it comes to the complicity of ecologists and of conservation in systemic racism and colonialism, and our need to work towards reconciliation. I think we conveniently forget that half of Indigenous people live in urban areas, that Indigenous nations remain rights holders in these areas. And I really love these words from Rena Sutar, who's the reconciliation planner for the Vancouver Parks Board, who talks about how everything in parks is a cultural expression. The language on the signs, the architecture, the landscape architecture, the permitted activities, the spaces designed for particular kinds of activity, all of those express the culture of the creators and the users. So what we choose to support controls who feels comfortable in these spaces. And this ties back into that question of access, who feels comfortable, safe, and welcome in our urban green spaces. Which cultures are we uplifting with our parks, and who are we perhaps pushing out? So urban green spaces are critical for health and well-being. They're literally life-saving spaces in many cases. Urban parks, as representations of our culture, can be critical places to engage a diversity of people in nature-based activities and connection to the land. So how are we actually doing in terms of protecting our nearby nature? What kind of progress are we making? Of course, we have municipal parks. And if you're interested in that level of protection and policy, I'd really point you towards the Parks People Report, which is a wonderful resource and starting place to learn about what we've done and where we're going. And it shows that 27 Canadian cities reported over 15,000 hectares of natural parkland, with a trend of increasing demand for park naturalization projects. But if we're talking about protected areas in a more formal sense, your neighborhood park may or may not, count in that kind of a framework. There are, of course, private protected areas in urban areas as well. Organizations like NCC have been playing a huge role in protecting urban nature and have really been pushing forward, and I would say picking up some of the slack here, as urban areas have sometimes been lower priority on a broader stage. So for example, around my own hometown of Windsor, Ontario, we see active restoration and protection of wetlands. I'm sure many of you in the audience would certainly speak to this and are involved in these kinds of activities better than I can. But today I really want to go big, and I want to think about national parks, what I'm sure many people might think of as kind of the crown jewel of our park system, or at least a very visible part of Canada's park system. Currently, Canada has 48 national parks, with only one set in an urban environment. So that's this little purple dot down here of Rouge National Urban Park, formed in Toronto in 2011. So nationally, urban areas have certainly not been a priority for protection. Fortunately, we're starting to recognize this need for natural areas in and around our cities on a much broader level. So some of you may be aware of the new federal announcements regarding urban protected areas, which are meant to contribute to protecting biodiversity, support climate resilience, connect people to nature, improve mental health and wellness, and increase social inclusion. That's a pretty tall mandate for these parks. Biodiversity, climate, connection, mental health and wellness, social inclusion, all in the same space. And with the creation of new parks, we have a chance also to do things better. Just as Faisal discussed more broadly, Parks Canada has pledged to work closely with Indigenous partners to ensure national urban parks provide space for Indigenous stewardship, promote Indigenous voices and stories, and offer opportunities for connection to lands and waters based on Indigenous knowledge and values. For example, in Saskatoon or Treaty 6 territory, where I'm actually speaking to you from today, Parks Canada and the Meewasin Valley Authority have signed a statement of collaboration to explore the potential for a national urban park in the Meewasin Valley, and Indigenous-led conservation is a priority in this particular case. In my hometown of Windsor, work is underway to protect and expand the city's largest green space, creating the Ojibwe National Urban Park. growing up in Windsor, I would never have thought this was a place where we would have an urban national park. It's certainly not the kind of city where most people are very connected to nature or have very much access to larger natural spaces. And of course, these urban protected areas might challenge our perceptions of what a national park should look like. These areas may be fragmented, they may be embedded in this urban matrix, but that doesn't make them less valuable to protect. And we'll come back to this example of Ojibwe Park in Windsor in a few minutes when we talk about urban biodiversity. So as we expand these urban areas, and knowing what we know about the role of nature in health and well-being, and the role of nature connection in building conservation mindsets and pro-nature behaviors, I want to come back to this question of whether the primary priority should be biodiversity, at least in the way that we tend to conceptualize biodiversity. How do we weight the priorities and the needs of different rights holders and stakeholders? And perhaps more importantly, when should that biodiversity come at the expense of access or use of nature by people in the city? And I'd love to hear some of your opinions and have a discussion on this at the end, because I certainly don't have all the answers here. But you can imagine very concrete ways that our priorities may shape the decisions we make about these future protected areas in urban areas or proximate to urban areas. For example, when we think of the shape of these parks, do we make them long and skinny so that they can reach more people? That's maybe not the shape that we would choose for optimal biodiversity protection. Or which activities do we allow and what do we outlaw in these spaces? But let's say we do want to stick with our plan of the primary goal is biodiversity conservation. Can we do that in the context of a city? Are these new urban protected areas actually going to contribute to biodiversity conservation on the national stage? We talked earlier about a few of the management challenges of urban protected areas. Cities, like many places where lots of people are coming and going, are hotspots for invasion. You undoubtedly have issues with dog strangling vine and buckthorn in Rouge National Park, for example. High levels of recreation can cause damage deliberately or accidentally. Urban areas are also usually pretty small too, in terms of the amount of nature that's left there. But the good news is, if managed well, there's no reason that small urban spaces can't also support high biodiversity. I won't spend a lot of time on this here, except to say that there is a narrative that I find particularly strong in Canada, that cities or other small fragments are kind of biodiversity deserts or unworthy of conservation efforts. And there are many studies now that show that this is not, in fact, true. Hopefully some of you have been fortunate to see Lenore Farrig's recently series of lectures through the RSC Romanowski lecture series, where she talks about this very topic, how small patches can pack a big punch for biodiversity. And we see this in our own work, for example, where we find uncommon pollinators in urban nature parks. For example, my colleague and postdoc Gail McInnes was thrilled to find this rare oil collecting bee, Macropus nuda, which specializes on Leishmantia plants in one of Montreal's nature parks, the only place in the city that they saw this particular specimen. And this general phenomenon is seen in many cities where urban green spaces can actually be a refuge for pollinators that are rare in the surrounding landscape. We also see this globally. For example, here we have an example from Kylie Sohn's work. I realize the text is too small here, but this is showing 39 threatened species that are restricted entirely to urban land in Australia. So protecting these species necessarily means protecting green spaces within and near our cities. And I think that we've all heard the kind of rocks and ice critique of our protected areas network. Placing protected areas near major urban centers virtually guarantees that we're protecting areas in southern Canada. For example, here in Ontario, there are many crises ecoregions with high biodiversity and high threat in the more urbanized parts of our province. And coming back to Windsor's Ojibwe Prairie Complex, this may be a small area, but it's home to more rare species than any other site in Ontario. So from a purely biodiversity-based perspective, how can we not consider these areas as high priority for protection? Now, I've presented a maybe somewhat rosy picture of urban protected areas as important for health and well-being and important for biodiversity. But of course, to get those benefits for health and well-being, these parks need to be accessible. And most of the challenges to urban biodiversity are a result of that very access. They're linked back to this intensity of use. In the city, we're constantly having to make choices because everything in a city is a fight for space. Do I use this land for housing or green space? If it's a green space, is it a community garden, a nature park, a soccer field? If it's a nature park, are we prioritizing recreation or conservation? And when faced with this limited space allocation, we want to get as much as we can out of our green spaces for nature and people. But if we design our green spaces for biodiversity, does this also make them better places for our health and well-being? If we prioritize the wants and needs of our human communities, does this actually go hand in hand with protecting biodiversity? There's this constant balance of more of a maybe fortress style conservation, keeping people out and providing access to communities that really need more nature exposure. And this is the critical challenge we're going to face, in my opinion, as we expand protected areas. And I would love to set out like a nice, oh, there we go. I would love to set out like a nice, 3-step blueprint or something for you here for how we can conserve biodiversity and still provide all the ecosystem services that we want. But this is actually an area of urban ecology that's not really well resolved. How biodiversity is actually linked to ecosystem services, to health and well-being, is a crucial frontier in this field. And it's a question that comes up again and again. So if we go back 5 years to Kremer's paper on the key insights for the future of urban ecosystem services, she notes that relationships between biodiversity and services in urban areas are unclear, lack evidence, require new data and empirical research. 4 years later, in 2020, when Knapp and colleagues outlined a research agenda for urban biodiversity, one of the 6 key areas in need of future work was again, biodiversity ecosystem service relationships. There is some emerging evidence that increased biodiversity, not just nature more generally, but actually more species can increase our well-being in terms of mental health. For example, here is a study that shows as we increase the species richness of birds, the bird song that we hear, people generally report a higher life satisfaction. It's actually a steeper relationship than the relationship between income and life satisfaction. But our enjoyment of urban nature might also depend on how we perceive diversity or who our audience is. So for example, my colleague Rose Graves used these manipulated images to assess how much hikers enjoyed different wildflower communities. And species richness actually was not something important or that people preferred. It was color. We like to see a diversity of colors. Using eBird data, Rose also showed that bird watchers don't necessarily favor locations based on diversity. Depending on what you're looking for in nature, biodiversity may not be a priority for you as a user of these spaces. Of course, there are other biophysical reasons we may prioritize biodiversity protection that many of us ecologists think about often. For example, this seems like a pretty nice street, like an area I would like to live that probably provides many ecosystem services. It looks cool and shady and inviting. And 3 years later, it looked like this because this was a street full of ash trees. And so having diversity can potentially provide resilience of our urban nature and prolong those benefits through time. And so I'm not trying to make the point that biodiversity doesn't matter. I personally think it does, but there's a lot more nuance to that relationship than we sometimes give credit to. And when we look across many studies in urban areas that have measured this relationship between some index of biodiversity, and some ecosystem service, the results we get are a little bit all over the map. Sometimes that relationship is positive. More diversity gives you more benefit. Sometimes it's negative. Often it doesn't really matter one way or the other, but most often service provision depends on who is there and what service you want. And we heard Faisal talk about cultural keystone species, species that might be really important for well-being for particular communities, but don't fit our typical definition of biodiversity in need of protection, right? That's one example of a more complicated biodiversity service relationship. And so in a broad sense, we have a really long way to go here to fully understand this relationship, and resolving this is going to be crucial to establishing urban protected areas that work for nature and people. We can't simply rely on, well, if we protect species, all of these benefits to people will follow. But certainly we know that if we only prioritize access and use of these habitats, we will see a loss of many species that we would like to protect as conservationists. This also means that advocating for biodiversity as the key to improving health and well-being might actually be kind of a hard sell, right? If we don't actually have strong evidence that these particular species we want to conserve are the same ones that are linked to well-being. However, I think there's kind of a silver lining here for ecologists. If in many cases, people just need a green space to support their health and well-being, that means we can use what we know about ecology to influence the management and design of urban nature. We can improve health and well-being by increasing access to urban nature, and then improve the biodiversity of these spaces once we have them protected. For this to be sustainable, though, I think we need to cultivate an ethos of caring, tackling the invasives, encouraging people to stay on trail when they're using these spaces. And for that, you're going to have to bring in one of my social science colleagues to give a talk, because cultivating care for urban nature is a very human challenge, not an ecological one. So where does that leave us? I think maybe I've raised more questions than I've answered them, but I want to end with a few personal thoughts as I worked through putting this lecture together. And first, I think we need to stop seeing urban proximate protected areas as an inherently bad thing or as a sign of degradation. Yes, there are challenges to protecting urban nature, but the opportunities are also huge for people's health and well-being. Think about the pigeon paradox or the butterfly affect. Having the opportunity to experience nature where you live is going to be a huge win for conservation, much more broadly than within our cities themselves. We also need to work towards a more ethical conservation field. So to make sure that all people in the city are able to benefit from these opportunities, we need to ensure that protected areas are accessible and welcoming to all. So allocating, really precious urban space to a protected area just to fence people out or scare people off is frankly, unjust. And so while this might be somewhat controversial to this kind of audience, I think access needs to be considered on an equal footing to biodiversity protection in this particular urban context. Once we've secured these spaces and improved the access, we can promote biodiversity within that context as best we can. And that's going to include changing mindsets and behaviors. So both education and restoration are going to play critical roles of ensuring that people can use urban natural spaces while minimizing risks to biodiversity. And of course, what kind of scientist would I be if I didn't think that more research is needed? So building on that last point, you need to critically consider whose needs and preferences we're holding up as priorities and who we're ignoring or pushing out of the conversation. And consider how those biodiversity priorities intersect with the values of urban rights holders and stakeholders. So we're going to need to make difficult decisions in an urban context. And I think we need to go into this with our eyes open. So we still need better knowledge of what trade-offs we're making when we prioritize certain biodiversity goals or the needs and wants of certain communities in these spaces. With that, I will thank you, and I've tried to leave lots of time for questions, not only for me, but perhaps addressing both Faisal's talk this morning and mine, and where we might see some commonalities between them.
And thank you, Dr. Zeter. That was wonderful. As a few people have already commented in there. You still have control over all of this because I know you want to talk, have a discussion, and of course, obviously there can be Q&A. So the floor is still yours. I'm going to mute myself back again unless I need to come in and moderate, and I will turn it back over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. Maybe I'll stop sharing so that people can see me and see each other. But if you have any slides you want me to bring back up, I'm very happy to do that. And just catching up on some of the comments in the chat, and I see we have Catherine Raining, who's the coordinator for Parks East Canada. If some of you are interested in that particular project, we can answer questions. And we also have a note from Will Kershaw saying that, for example, Banff has a small area of urban space. And so certainly when we talk about urban protected areas, that can be a broad umbrella, where some of the protected areas that we don't necessarily think of or call urban do obviously have developed areas very close to their boundaries, and those will have effects on those spaces. And so certainly I think sometimes we're too quick to divide things into like, well, this one's an urban protected area and these ones aren't. And that's going to change as we urbanize as well. I would love to open the floor to general comments, questions. I know we have people in the audience who are working in the field of urban conservation as practitioners as well, and can maybe speak more directly to some of these challenges. And feel free, if you're feeling shy, to put your questions or comments in the chat as well.
I was just going to say that actually they can do that as well.
Looks like Faisal has a hand up.
Oh, go for it. Yes, please. I'm Carly. You can actually take over control at this point in terms of questions, and as I say, I'll just stay in the background. Okay.
Sure.
Thanks, Carly. That was absolutely phenomenal. A really, really beautiful presentation. And it's more of a comment. I'm just really glad that you emphasize the significance of Indigenous governance to biodiversity protection in cities. I think we need to remember that our cities and suburbs were and continue to be established on Indigenous territories, in many cases unceded Indigenous territories. And I think the idea of Indigenous protected and conserved areas that are being established primarily in rural and northern regions of the country are probably a really applicable governance option for urban areas as well, in part because of what Carly said, which is the significance of the urban Indigenous population in the country. So thank you so much for emphasizing that. Really, I'd like that. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that comment and for your wonderful talk this morning. I think, like we heard from some of the comments this morning, this is not something that I felt I received a lot of education on necessarily as an ecologist, as a conservation biologist. And it's an area that I'm still certainly learning and have really benefited tremendously from conversations, at workshops and conferences with some of the people you mentioned, actually, Elder Albert or Danica Littlechild, who have challenged some of my perceptions on nature and how we relate to it. And I think it is an area where I see urban ecologists maybe letting themselves off the hook, maybe is not the right word, but just not necessarily acknowledging in the same way that urban areas are spaces for Indigenous-led conservation and protected areas. This is not like a rural issue that we can kind of push off because we're working in cities. I think there are also some parallels between some of what you mentioned in your talk and your work on the importance of working with local communities and understanding people's connections to nature and the values of rights holders and stakeholders. That's certainly something that my students and I think a lot about as we approach our work in an urban context, an urban environment. Yeah, I see there's a couple of comments in the chat, one from Ed Morris talking about Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen the role of urban protected areas as refuges for the homeless. Our city is really struggling with this. Many of the homeless in our city are also Indigenous. I apologize if this is a tangent. I don't think that's a tangent. I think that's a really relevant thing to bring up, that, you know, when we're talking about users of these spaces, that's not only visitors, for example. I think we've seen, particularly, you know, in Toronto, I know in Montreal, we've seen people being, you know, removed or pushed out of encampments in green spaces and parks. And I think we need to really critically evaluate what kind of message we're sending when we take those kinds of actions, and who these spaces, who we all kind of implicitly think these spaces are for when we're thinking of the actions that we take in our urban parks. There's a comment from Brian Banks. Thoughts about managing nature and people conflict. So coyotes, most recently in Stanley Park, seem to be a common concern. How does that test how much biodiversity is tolerated? That is a great question, and something that I am not a wildlife expert, but definitely I think where a lot of this stems from is a need for education, especially as we move towards protecting more urban spaces and trying to bring nature back in our cities. That means bringing types of nature that people may not perceive as positive back into our cities. And particularly when we think of, someone in the audience can correct me if I'm misinterpreting the coyote conflict in Stanley Park, because I only know of it from, you know, the articles I read in the news. But it seems to me that a lot of these issues are coming from inappropriate interactions between people and nature, right? Where we are perhaps feeding urban populations that we shouldn't be, or interacting with urban wildlife in unsafe ways. And that can result in having to remove this wildlife, or having to take measures that we could have avoided if people were more knowledgeable and more respectful of the nature that we share our cities with. And so I think there is a really critical role for communication, or for education rather, about appropriate ways of relating to wildlife. I think we've probably all seen, you know, news articles about like the Instagram influencer who went in and ruined some natural space, or people, we've probably seen people like walk up to dangerous wildlife and try and take photos. And as we bring more nature into proximity with our cities, we need to have the accompanying education of, you know, this is how we respect and relate to wild creatures who are living in our midst. And so certainly there's an education element. I think your point on tolerance is relevant here as well, that there are many people who in theory probably support having more nature in our cities, but then when that comes to having the kind of nature they don't like, that becomes a challenge. And so that has to do with people's perceptions, right? And we see similar cases in the plant realm, for example, when people bring in like rewilded gardens, or bring in more native species to their landscapes rather than the perfect green lawn, and people are kind of affronted by this, like, how could you do this in this space? And so I think it is an education challenge first and foremost, but there are also going to have to be difficult decisions about wildlife management in these spaces, as well as we have people interacting with nature in ways that may or may not be safe. Yeah, question from Jackie. Do you want me to read it out? Do you want to unmute your mic and give your thoughts as well? You're welcome to. People are welcome to talk.
Sure, I can ask and give you a break.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'm deep in thinking about this kind of tragedy of the commons, and Ostrom's work to look at how there isn't always a tragedy in these common spaces, and urban areas are such an interesting example of these common spaces where there's so many different desires for the land, as you talked about. So this is kind of just leading me to wonder if you have any thoughts on the like types of governance of urban protected areas, and who sets the rules, and how, you know, national parks speaking to Faisal's presentation, have a very dark history of who sets what the governance of those spaces are, and maybe if you have any kind of good examples of urban areas governance.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think part of starting to reconcile or overcome some of this dark colonialist history we have with protected areas is trying other forms of governance and ensuring that we have multiple rights holders and stakeholders at the table. So in an urban area, especially where you have so many different people with conflicting wants and needs, maybe it's idealistic, but can we bring as many of those people around the table as possible to understand, really understand and listen to what the wants and needs are as we're making decisions about the management of these areas. And so I think who sets the rules and how, I mean, ideally, you wouldn't have one entity setting the rules, at least not without significant consultation. And so I would like to see more examples of kind of co-management of these spaces, including perhaps local NGOs, local community leaders, local Indigenous nations coming to the table to work together. In terms of examples of that, certainly we do sometimes see examples of that on a smaller, municipal scale, for example. Like I know in Montreal, we have examples of parks that are co-managed by the city and by community-led organizations, friends of types of organizations, where particularly in cases where local people and citizens have fought for the protection of a particular green space and then stay involved as co-managers of that space. And so I think it is possible. Now, in cases, for example, where we have, Parks Canada establishing a new national urban park, they obviously are the governing body of that space. And I think they really have a responsibility to ensure that they are bringing in other perspectives when they decide on the management. And I think we are, well, I guess we'll see once they're established whether we see that, but we are seeing certainly, language and rhetoric around wanting to co-manage these spaces with local groups and bringing in additional perspectives. So I think ensuring that there's not, absolute power given to one entity is really important. And particularly in the city, paying attention to diverse voices. Not everyone is going to relate to these spaces in the same way or feel safe and welcome in these spaces in the same way. And so really critically listening to the stories of people who, or the lived experiences rather, of people who have not felt welcome in these spaces is important before we start managing new ones.
I'll ask one just to sort of keep the conversation moving a bit. And this is not a view that I share myself, but I have had people sort of confront me saying that the establishment or focus on urban national parks or things like that threaten to weaken the legislative side, the governance side of it. How do you feel about that? I mean, I've got my own opinions, but I'd rather, how do you feel about that?
Sure. I think it's been very interesting starting my career as an explicitly urban ecologist in Canada, because there have been many strong opinions about how, basically kind of along the lines of what you said, there's too much focus on urban nature, and this isn't, in keeping with this kind of larger ethos. And it's like you're like betraying the field of ecology by focusing on these developing spaces. And I think the very short answer I would give to that is protecting urban spaces doesn't mean we give up on the rest of the spaces, right? Like the fact that I am studying ecology in people's backyards doesn't mean that that doesn't take away from, my colleagues who are studying caribou or the boreal forest. I think we need a portfolio of approaches. We need an all hands on deck approach if we want to protect nature across the country. And that's not exclusive to urban areas, but it includes urban areas. And so certainly I don't see this as taking something away. I see this as adding something to the conversation. And certainly I think when you talk about things from a legislative perspective, I'm not a legislator, but I can see that you might want some different rules in urban areas than more broadly. And I think that's part of why, when you look at Rouge National Park, it's Rouge National Urban Park. They've included the word likely as a way to differentiate some of the management choices that are being made. And so I don't think that adding a new category weakens existing, protection or conservation. I think having a diversity of approaches strengthens this portfolio of approaches. Obviously, I work in these areas, so I'm going to have that opinion, right? And maybe someone else would take the opposite side. But I think there is this, and maybe Faisal can speak to this as well. I think sometimes people have this like knee-jerk reaction of like, well, you doing things differently means that I'm doing things wrong, or you're saying I'm doing things wrong. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. We're saying, look, there are other ways of doing things that we need to explore and we need to consider. It's not meant to make anyone feel like they're not protecting the right places or they're not focusing on the right areas.
I'll actually turn it over to Faisal if you wish, sir. The only thing I'll add is that I always thought it was sort of lack of imagination because the IUCN has categories which are cultural and built and everything else. I mean, it's kind of interesting though that those are the well, not lower numbers, of the numbers down below, right? So it's sort of interesting. It was ordered sort of one was the best one and then sort of down from there. So I always thought it was a bit of a tell, to say the least,
Yeah,
right?
I do think certainly there's kind of a view that you're like sitting at the kids' table. It's like,
Right.
oh, you're studying cities, like that's really cute. Okay, and I actually think that the last year and everyone's experiences through COVID and suddenly being limited to urban green spaces has changed a lot of viewpoints and brought a lot of people around to this idea that urban green spaces are important and valuable and beautiful and magical of their own right. And so I think the perception is changing. And I'm seeing a comment about connectivity in the chat where I think that's a really important viewpoint too, that these urban areas are fragmenting our broader landscapes. And so protecting green spaces through urban areas is going to also serve broader regional conservation by allowing species to stop over or move through. And so these are two pieces of the same puzzle when it comes to protection of our habitat. We're not saying like, let's give up on natural areas. Natural is a tricky word, but like, we're not saying on like, let's give up on areas outside the city. We're saying, hey, let's also protect these areas that maybe historically we've seen as unimportant.
It gets even worse because being an urban, not just an urban, but urban restoration ecologist is the same sort of problem because I mean, I'm having not much truck with the sort of restorative activities continuum the SER has put on there. That's well known. I'm not telling tales of school. And the problem is it's like, it's all restoration at some level. It's just a matter of, where is it? And what you just said about parks, it's the same thing. You're not diminishing something else. What you're saying is that you actually have to be more inclusive. And I think less instrumentalist because, you mentioned, of course, the whole idea of equal services. So to Faisal about some of the stuff and all the sort of ideas there. And I keep thinking, why do we have to have a rationale for protecting like urban green spaces? Oh, well, it's for well-being. It may be, and that's really actually hard to establish, but really doesn't matter because shouldn't it be an intrinsic value rather than instrumental one? So there's all kinds of discussions with there too.
We could have a long conversation.
I know
about
we'll leave
that,
everybody else out, which is bad. So I want to do that. Faisal may want to chime in.
I'll let other people.
Yeah, we may, and we have others as well. So that's something out there. So Ed has made a comment as well. So anybody else wants to comment? We're in kind of the general discussion phase. We will end at noontime because I don't like keeping our guest speakers, especially, or anybody else on that one. If anybody else to chime in on this or other discussions, please do so. There's some excellent comments in the chat for those of you following along. Oh, Faisal may want to come in.
I think I really liked Carly's talk, the emphasis on cultural and amenity ecosystem services. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the role of nature in mitigating climate change or urban nature as green infrastructure to protect our communities from flooding. But we often ignore the importance of green space, even highly impacted green space, in terms of cultural continuity. And so, you know, and it was interesting that we both kind of referenced ecosystem services. And I think that for me, this is something that I would like to see policymakers pay more attention to in terms of the establishment and management of protected areas, be them in urban systems or in intact areas.
Thank you. Turning it back to Dr. Zeter.
Yeah, I think that comment brings me back to this idea of the need for a portfolio of approaches where, you know, I've been thinking about ecosystem services for a long time, longer than I've been thinking about urban areas. And, you know, some people are going to be swayed by the, you know, temperature regulation or the flooding argument, and some people are going to be swayed by the, you know, cultural amenities or the beauty of urban nature. And the more kind of approaches we can bring forward, the more people we can hopefully kind of get on board. And so it's another case where I think there's not one right way to kind of advocate for nature or to think about nature. We need multiple approaches. And of course we do. There was a comment in the chat about there's a finite number of people and a finite amount of money. And that's absolutely true, that we do have to make difficult decisions about what and how to prioritize. But ultimately, I do think protecting urban nature, you know, many of the people who may be persuaded to give money towards nature conservation, for example, they're living in cities, they're growing up in cities. And so bringing more of a focus to protecting urban nature and increasing people's exposure and connection to nature ultimately may help with our broader conservation goals as well.
We also have a question from Nikki here coming as well too there. And Nikki, just for everybody's edification, actually is one of our excellent people who have actually made Casiopa a reality. So thank you.
Oh, you're too kind, Steve.
So Nikki here is talking about participation in restoration planting event with a local group, running out of municipal owned or managed land for projects to engage community volunteers in. Any ideas on how we navigate these situations? Yes, and so I think this is where my usual topic of like thinking outside the park comes back, right? Where there are many ways for people to engage with nature in the city beyond particular parks or protected areas. And so we see, for example, you know, grassroots initiatives to green alleyways in Montreal and in Toronto, or to establish community gardens, or to create projects on vacant land, or projects for homeowners who might have access to yards in certain cities. And so there are many spaces in our cities that are home to like bits and pieces and patches of nature that can contribute more broadly than only on you know, municipal owned land. And so I think there is certainly space for interested community members to be engaged and get involved in the city.
Excellent, an excellent question, Nikki. Are there any other questions that you would like to have, or either of our speakers wish to, you know, wrap anything up they wish to? We will pause for a moment here to see if anybody has anything else they wish to do. I know after a couple of hours, actually, people start to run out of steam, and I appreciate that.
We're all getting a little Zoom fatigue.
Yeah, I know. Well, and this is why I never plan these things for like the all-day sessions, because that's just not a good idea.
And I'm very happy. I'll put my email in the chat here, but I'm very happy to take, you know, questions or comments or thoughts from anyone who'd like to comment me. Oh, yeah, we have a hand here.
The better Stephen actually has a comment. I'm going to mute myself.
Hi, I'm Stephen Marin with the Ministry of Natural Resources with Ontario. I have a question. I guess it's sort of for both Faisal and Carly in a sense. And you know, I think we've seen in the last decade or so a little bit of a shift when we're thinking about protected areas towards a little bit more of a anthropocentric kind of approach, for in many ways good reasons that you've both brought up, you know, the importance of of nature to people and indigenous concerns and so forth. I wonder though, with our, the kind of historic importance of ecological integrity being the kind of primary determinant or primary driver for protected areas. If you worry about losing some of that focus, given the the biodiversity crisis that we face, like how should we be balancing those concerns between that I guess challenge between the duality of people and nature?
Ending with a tough question.
I was going to say, I'm glad I don't have to tackle that, so I'm turning over.
Maybe I'll add a few comments. I don't it's not an answer, but I think it's a reflection. So I spent most of my early career focused on trying to protect the world's last remaining intact forests. I used to be the Director General for the David Suzuki Foundation and worked as a negotiator on some very large land use planning exercises, including the establishment of the Great Bear Rainforest, we were very much focused on trying to protect, remaining intact areas, particularly for charismatic, wide-ranging focal species. The one thing that I have learned since that time is that many of these intact areas that exhibit high degrees of ecological integrity are not unpeopled places, and they never were unpeopled places. And the danger is that we ignore that many of the conservation outcomes that we're so desperately trying to protect are in fact, many of the conservation values that we're so desperately trying to protect are in fact the outcomes of thousands of years of Indigenous stewardship. And so I think I'll just sort of emphasize this idea that I don't see a duality between people and nature as much as I did when I was a young conservation biology student, and I was being told, that fortress conservation is what's needed. We need to keep people out of parks. But it's just an observation. I don't know if it adds anything of significance.
I think that's a really.
I think that fortress conservation. Sorry, Carly. I think that fortress conservation is a great phrase. Back over to you, Carly.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think I often use the term like people and nature because I think people intuitively kind of understand what you're trying to say when you say that, but they're not two different things. And I think we need to look to what we might call like the bright spots, like look to examples where we have managed areas well to conserve biodiversity, which as Faisal mentioned is often Indigenous managed lands. We need to look at places where we've done this well and learn from those and see how can we, if there is a duality there, how can we kind of overcome that? I don't think these views of like, well, we need to protect nature without people have been particularly successful in a lot of cases. And I think there are some challenges to taking that perspective. And I think there is also a need for education as well about why do we need ecological integrity? Why do we need particular species? Why are we setting the goals and priorities that we're setting? Because if people don't understand why those are the goals, they won't necessarily be on board or help us to reach them. And so really thinking critically about which priorities we're kind of upholding and why, and looking to places where we've been able to achieve that in collaboration with people rather than to their exclusion. But there's no easy answer to that question. I think that's kind of the heart of what many of us are trying to understand and learn.
Yeah, so I guess my question wasn't about whether we should be excluding people from parks. It was more about what the ultimate goal is. And for some people, if that ultimate goal is ecological integrity, is there a way to sort of achieve that through how people engage with protected areas? So Faisal brought up the Indigenous question, and you know, we know that people have managed these systems for many thousands of years through use of fire and things like that. Is there a way to do more of those kinds of things so that we're achieving particular kind of ecological goals, but doing it in the way that we're sort of engaging with nature rather than just sort of you know, focusing on that duality, because you know, bringing it back into the urban context, I wonder why, you know, if the goal is for people, why not just do you know, a community garden or you know, a botanical garden or something else, right? Why do you need it? Why call it a protected area anyway?
Yeah, that's a great question and a hard question. And I think in urban areas, I mean, we say for people, but there are many different communities of people who may value nature in different ways. And there certainly are many communities within our cities who do want and value what you might say are more, you know, higher integrity spaces or wilder spaces. Not everyone wants the botanical garden, right? And so I think there probably are ways to manage areas in a way that includes people, but also upholds some of these ecological values. And I think that's going to be the big challenge in many areas of our field moving forward, is how do we do that? What works and what doesn't, and learning from cases that do work.
That's a good point.
It's not something we have an answer to yet. No. I don't have an answer to it yet in
No.
urban areas, at least. Maybe other people have an answer in their own fields, certainly.
It's a great question, Stephen, and a good place actually to sort of contemplate. I'm going to unfortunately conclude everything because we're just passing noon here actually as well, in deference to our speakers as well as everybody else. So once again, my thanks to Dr. Mula and Dr. Cedar for joining us, especially Dr. Cedar, we got up early this morning. I had not realized you're going to be at West. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
I hadn't either.
That's fair enough. Fair enough. And I want to thank Stephanie and Nikki and Emily who have helped us out through this sort of area in here. For those of you hearing my phone, that's nothing other than acknowledging a student's actually out in one of the parks doing research. And that's sort of something that we've been able to strive to do. My also thanks to Rob and Karen who have actually supported us all through this as well. And it's been nice to sort of get this sort of back on track in terms of trying to ensure that we have a series. We will be through Casiopa having, of course, our annual conferences. We also will be having our webinars. Obviously, of course, the pandemic is not over yet, but we're hoping next year to be able to do both an in-person and a online one. So you'll see a lot more of this hybrid because it is easier to bring in speakers, obviously, from around the world. And it also is easier for a lot of people to attend. So I don't think you'll see that sort of ending anytime soon. And there will be opportunities, I think, for people to be able to sort of be more in person. So a fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much. We set a record for the number of participants coming in and out of the participation. This thing has been recorded and will be available soon, probably by the end of the week, on the Casiopa YouTube channel. And I will sort of ensure that that's made aware of it. So thank you very much to everybody. All right, I'm going to turn it. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn this off and end the meeting. So thanks a lot and have a good rest of the day. Thanks so much.